Hey guys, it's Miss Sailor here. So we're going to be talking today. We're going to be continuing the road to revolution. This is part 3. So we're going to talk about the Townsend Acts and the Boston Massacre. So colonists are overjoyed with the repeal of the Stamp Act, and they saw it as a defense of their liberty. But it doesn't last long. See, we talked about the Declaratory Act of 1766, which basically said that Great Britain was supreme, they had supreme authority over the colonies, and Parliament would soon begin to exercise that authority. So in 1767, with the passage of the Townsend Acts, a tax on consumer goods in British North America, colonists again are up in arms because they believe their liberty is coming under assault for a second time. Now, at the end of the last one, we had the Prime Minister Grenville, who was quietly dismissed by the King. He was replaced by a Lord Rockingham as Prime Minister, but it was very short. Rockingham is the one who helped repeal the Stamp Act, but he doesn't last long, only a year, 65 to 66, because he's very sympathetic to the colonists, and because of that, Parliament is worried, rich landowners are worried, so the King eventually dismisses him as well. Now, he's replaced by William Pitt. He's also sympathetic. The thing with Pitt is that he's old and he's ill. His chancellor is Charles Townsend, whose job is to manage the empire's finances, which he takes very seriously. So his first act is to deal with the unruly New York Assembly. You remember we spoke about the Quartering Act. So the New York Assembly had voted not to pay for the supplies for a garrison for British soldiers under the Quartering Act. Now, the way Townsend handles this is he proposes the Restraining Act of 1767, which would disband the New York Assembly until it agreed to pay for the garrison supplies, which eventually it does agree to do. Now, you also have the Townsend Revenue Act of 1767. This is the one that places the dues on things like paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. These British goods had to be imported since the colonies did not have a way to manufacture them. Townsend was hopeful that the new duties would not anger the colonists because they were an external tax, not an internal one like the Stamp Act had been. He also passed the Indemnity Act of 1767. This exempted tea products that was imported by the British East India Company from taxation as it was imported to Great Britain. Now, when that tea was re-exported to the colonies, however, the colonists had to pay taxes on it because of the Revenue Act that had been passed. So, some of the critics of Parliament on both sides saw this tax as a policy as an example of corrupt politicians creating a monopoly. So the Revenue Act, it also gave the custom boards greater power to counteract smuggling issues. Those writs of assistance that we talked about in part 2, basically their search warrants, the custom commissioners who suspected the presence of contraband, they could use this as a way to get in. Furthermore, to ensure compliance, Townsend introduces the Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767, which created an American Board of Customs to enforce trade laws. Now, customs enforcement had been based in Great Britain, but the rules have been difficult to implement because of the distance. Smuggling is very rampant in the colonies. Now, this new customs board is based in Boston. Townsend also orchestrated the Vice Admiralty Court Act, which established 3 more Vice Admiralty courts in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston to try violators of customs regulations without a jury. Remember, we spoke about them. They're tribunals and they don't have juries. All told, the Townsend Acts resulted in higher taxes and a stronger British power to enforce them. And what they're trying to do is search for solutions for the debt problem in Great Britain and the growing sense that the colonies need to be brought under control. Now, like the Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, they produced controversy and protests. They lead to more boycotts. So for a second time, colonists feel resented as they're paying taxes without representation. They're being deprived of their liberty. The fact that the revenue the Townsend Act raised paid for royal governors only made the situation worse, because it takes control away from colonial legislators that otherwise had the power to set and withhold a royal governor's salary. So, when Townsend had the Restraining Act passed, it was intended to isolate New York without angering the other colonies Now, it had the opposite effect, showing the rest of the colonies how far beyond the British Constitution some members of the Parliament were willing to go. So, an overreach situation. Now, the Townsend Acts, they generated a number of protest writings, including in 1768, Samuel Adams writes a letter that becomes known as the Massachusetts Circular, sent by the Massachusetts House of Reps to the other colonial legislators. The letter laid out the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation. In other words, it was unconstitutional to tax them. It encouraged the other colonies to again protest the taxes by boycotting British goods once again. Now, Britain's response to this disobedience only served to unite the colonies further. See, initially the response to it was pretty lukewarm at best. However, when back in Great Britain, they demanded that Massachusetts retract the letter and promised that any colonial assemblies that endorsed it would be dissolved. That's what set and chained the motion of the uniting of the colonies on Massachusetts' side. So once again, you have the Daughters and Sons of Liberty who are calling for that boycotting of British goods. The boycott is from 68 to 69, and it turned the purchase of consumer goods into a political gesture. The Massachusetts Circular got Parliament's attention because in 1768, Lord Hillsborough sends 4,000 British troops to Boston to deal with the unrest and to put down any potential rebellion. The troops are a constant reminder of the assertion of British power over the colonies and an illustration of the unequal relationship between members of the same empire. In an added aggravation, British soldiers are moonlighting as dock workers, creating competition for employment in an already very tight job market. So many Bostonians, led by the Sons of Liberty, mounted a campaign of constant harassment against British troops. They are also, the Sons of Liberty, protecting the smuggling actions of merchants so that they can get crucial things that has to do with their boycotting that they are participating in. John Hancock is one of Boston's most successful merchants and prominent citizens. While he maintains too high of a profile to work actively with the Sons of Liberty, he was known to support their aims, if not their means of achieving them. He is also one of the many prominent merchants who had the fortunes by smuggling, which was rampant in colonial seaports. So, British soldiers are crushing the riots, but over the next few years, clashes between British officials and Bostonians becomes very common. In fact, you have what leads to the conflict. It turns deadly on March the 5th in 1770, in the confrontation that became known as the Boston Massacre. There was an angry crowd who gathered and attacked a squad of British soldiers guarding the customs house. They were throwing snowballs and rocks and sticks at the British soldiers. As a result of the scuffle, soldiers who had become frightened fired into the crowd, and they killed 5 people. Now, this gentleman on the right is Crispus. He is the first man killed, the first official casualty of the War for Independence. He's an African-American descendant. This bloodshed illustrated the hostility that had developed as a result of Boston's occupation. The Sons of Liberty immediately seized control of this and began using it as propaganda. They're trying to characterize British soldiers as murderers. They have the victims as martyrs. Paul Revere, he's circulating an engraving that shows a line of grim redcoats firing ruthlessly into the crowd with fleeing citizens. So they really take off with this. As it turns out, though, the Boston Massacre occurred after Parliament had partially repealed the Townsend Acts. So by the late 1760s, the American boycott of British goods had drastically reduced British trade, as it did the first time. So once again, British merchants who are losing a bunch of money are trying to pressure Parliament to loosen its restrictions, please, and to break that non-importation movement. Charles Townsend actually dies suddenly in 1767. He's replaced by Lord North, who is very inclined to be more workable with the colonists. So North convinces Parliament to drop all of the Townsend Acts except the tax on tea. They also keep the American Board of Custom Commissioners and the Vice Admiralty courts because it helps the way they're controlling trade. Those who had protested the Townsend Acts for several years, this partial repeal appeared to be a major victory. So for the second time, colonists have rescued liberty from an unconstitutional parliamentary power. The hated British troops eventually departed Boston, and the consumption of British goods skyrocketed once again. But don't be confused. Underneath all of this, while they are very happy that they've once again been able to gain control of what they feel like is their liberty and rights as British citizens, underneath you have definitely some spewing ideas and philosophies of how they feel they should be treated. So that's going to be the end of the Road of Revolution Part 3, the Road to Revolution Part 3. And I will cover Part 2, which will be the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party tomorrow.